Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, this week the Nigerian Global Economic Summit took place in the British capital, and high-profile speakers addressed the critical role diaspora industry leaders play in nation building. Channel's Business Global was given exclusive access, and we will share the highlights from the two-day event later on in the show. And Iran's president has warned that he will not accept chaos as authorities continue to crack down on protests that have swept across the country since the death in custody of a young woman. Azadeh Porzand, a human rights researcher at SOAS University, will be joining me from London for more insight into the demonstrations. Then later, I'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with a story that continues to make headlines here in the UK and across the world. The British Prime Minister Liz Truss has insisted the government's tax-cutting measures are the right plan to get the economy growing. This is despite the British pound dropping to its lowest level against the US dollar. In her first public comment since the chaos, Truss defended Kwasi Kwarteng's measures, insisting urgent action was needed.
But what I'm saying is if we hadn't acted, and the majority of the package that we announced on Friday was about energy price support. If we hadn't acted on Friday to help people with their energy bills, people would be facing bills of up to £6,000 this winter. And I couldn't let that happen. And the Chancellor couldn't let that happen.
Well, earlier I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for more on this story. Well, clearly the ladies are not for turning, Simon. Liz Truss doubling down on Kwasi Kwarteng's £45 billion worth of tax cuts. What is the fallout for this, both economically and politically, of course?
Well, I think a lot of people are looking at Kwasi Kwarteng and they're a bit worried for his job. There are supposedly letters going in against Liz Truss. I think it's unlikely that she's going to lose her job so soon. But I think given that it's his first thing that he's done as Chancellor, and it's gone so badly wrong now at least, that it looks like he's under quite a lot of pressure, because even though these are quite a few of Liz Truss's policies that she was talking about in the Conservative leadership drive, it's him which is his face, it's his policies, he's signed it off, he was the one who stood up in Parliament and gave that speech. And yeah, like you said, the Chancellor said that he will be sticking to the plan. That's after Prime Minister Liz Truss defended it. Today, a reminder, of course, that the pound is currently in free fall. It's just going down and down, and it's crashed to its lowest level against the dollar in 37 years. And it continues to get worse and worse. It doesn't matter what the Bank of England do, which they've stepped in, but it's only had a sort of a minor kind of effect. The former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney saying that the UK's monetary policy and fiscal policy have been working at cross purposes, so basically people haven't been talking to each other. And the Bank of England, they stepped in and said they'd buy £65 billion worth of government bonds on a temporary basis, and that did have a little effect, but basically everything's going pretty badly in terms of the pound. And obviously it's good for some people, it's good for hedge fund managers who bet against the currency, it's good for people from abroad who have different currencies, especially Americans who can come over and they can buy things at cheap rates here. But for the rest of us, it's not great. And I think, yeah, the fallout will be that obviously Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are under a lot of pressure for this to turn this around. It's most certainly helped the opposition parties. Lots of polls saying that the Labour Party now have a double-digit lead, and that's coincided with their conference season. And Sir Keir Starmer has come out pretty well in this conference. You may remember last year, Jeremy Corbyn was a big presence there, or the lack of him there. He's had none of that here, and he seems to have been quite statesmanlike in terms of his speech. So I think the political fallout will be that the Conservative Party will be more worried than ever about the Labour Party and the potential that they will get back into power, especially if this continues.
It's been humiliating, hasn't it? Utterly humiliating.
Yeah, I mean, it has, and it's drawn all attention away from everything else. We were talking about the cost of living crisis. Well, now it's the economy, and it all rolls into one, right? You need a strong economy. This is why they gave what a lot of people are calling a very reckless mini budget, doing away with bankers' bonus limits in the hope that the city would kickstart some kind of revival that then would trickle down. And yeah, lots of essentially unfunded tax cuts and extra spending, which is what you may remember her rival in this, Rishi Sunak, was saying would potentially happen, that the pound would plummet, inflation would grow, and that's kind of where we are now. So I think people are looking at whether the Bank of England's decisions here will have any kind of effect and whether there will be any kind of rolling back. because at the moment, like you say, they're sticking to their guns, but it doesn't seem to be working.
You're right. Let's see what happens next week. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
To other news now, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, the British Iranian national who spent 6 years in jail in Iran, has become the latest high-profile figure to cut her hair to lend support to women protesting in Iran in the wake of the death of young Iranian woman Mahsa Amini. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi said the 22-year-old's death saddened everyone in the country, but maintained that chaos will not be accepted as he addressed the widespread clashes that have spread beyond Iran's borders. Well, for more on this story, I'm now being joined by Azadeh Pourzand, a human rights researcher at SOAS University. Azadeh joins me from London. Azadeh Pourzand, it's a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global. I think the world is pretty much aware of the deadly protests that have a death toll of at least 76 in Iran. It's pretty difficult to get the accurate figure. For our viewers that may not be familiar with what sparked the demonstrations, can you just give us a broad insight on what's taking place in the country?
Yes, so as you mentioned, we're experiencing a wave of protests, but also more and more strikes, formal and informal strikes being called out by different sectors of the society. And it's now, I think, nearing its second week. And it was sparked by the killing, the death in custody of a 22-year-old a young woman who was stopped for inadequate Islamic veil, which is compulsory in Iran. And within 2 hours, she went into a coma, brain dead, and then was declared dead. And the nation somehow, Mahsa Amini, or Gina, who was also her name was Gina, Gina's death sort of sparked an entire nation in an unprecedented way. It, I think, reminded the many Iranians who set out in the streets and risked their lives and freedom that women's rights matter, that women's right to their body matter, and also with incredible maturity understood the protesters made a link between women's freedom, dignified life, and freedom for all. So, you know, the slogan of women, life, freedom, which is the predominant slogan in addition to many anti-regime slogans, is something that I think will stay in Iran's history, and it will remind the Iranians that for as long as the women and their other at-risk and discriminated groups are not respected and don't experience freedom, the entire nation cannot be free. And in this context, I think the protesters explicitly then basically are demanding the regime to go, because they don't see their freedom to be attainable any longer in the hands of the current government in place, the Islamic Republic of Iran.
It does appear as if the protests have spilled into other areas of dissatisfaction. Can you touch on that very briefly about what else people are coming out on the streets for before we let you go?
Yes, the slogans have been pretty blunt. I cannot imagine how courageous these individuals have to be to chant out slogans that questions the entirety of the Islamic Republic. They have left no doubt that these protesters, they don't only want to abolish the Islamic veil, but also a government that is discriminatory and repressive. But also you have to understand, Iran today is experiencing a socioeconomic crisis, a deep, increasing one, a climate crisis that Iranians believe that is rooted to the mismanagement and corruption of the government, and more a sense of a crisis of political legitimacy. All of this leaves very little hope for your average young person, a 20-year-old, who does not see a future for themselves. And I think the courage that we see on the street is because, unfortunately, many of them just don't see themselves being able to tolerate life as is, and therefore are willing to go and even have to die for fighting for their freedom.
Wow, Azadeh, I think you're describing, a similar sentiment across the globe, including in Nigeria. Azadeh Porzand, human rights researcher at SOAS University. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. We must get you back on the show again soon. Thank you, Azadeh.
Thank you so much.
To other news now, former US President Donald Trump has once again found himself at the focal point of an investigation, this time by the New York Attorney General Letitia James. James is in the process of suing the former president and 3 of his children for fraud, with the aim of getting them barred from doing business in the state. Well, for more on the fallout, I'm now being joined by Errol Moorcock, who is the Vice Chair of External Relations at Republicans Overseas. Errol joins me from St Andrews in Scotland. Errol Moorcock, it's a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global today. I've got to tell you, Trump's critics are convinced that this New York Attorney General lawsuit may be the legal action that finally holds Trump accountable. Will it?
Well, unfortunately for them, they will find themselves perhaps getting counterpunched in civil court. You know, it's one thing to run a campaign for Attorney General entirely on chasing a businessman out of town, chasing a resident out of town. That crosses a lot of ethical things. The idea that they couldn't find you criminally guilty, so they decided to take you to civil court where they have to be 51-49 on a left-wing jury, that's obviously not going to hold up. You're going to find a situation where this is going to play to Trump's favor. This is exactly what he said they were going to do. And when they couldn't find any evidence of wrongdoing, just like with the Mueller probe, just like with all the other things, this time they've taken the unprecedented step of actually not only trying to sue him, but banish him in sort of an Athenian kind of hearkening back to the origination of democracy, where a citizen is cast aside and sent away. It has no precedent, and it's not going to hold up. And like most times, the left, when they get their hands on a good set of cards, they overplay it. They don't know how to bluff, and they end up losing the hand. And I think in this situation, that's what you're going to see. And it's going to play into our hands. But in the short term, this isn't good for Donald Trump. This doesn't look good in the media. This doesn't look good to the non-sophisticated, regular voter. I mean, politically non-sophisticated, somebody who's not bothering nonstop to read this. I've had friends reach out to me and say, hey, looks like he's going down. They're just reading the headlines. And if it's a battle of the headlines, the Democrats certainly have yet another one to stick in there before the midterms, along with their unprecedented FBI raid of his home. So it'll be interesting to see.
Errol, thank you for touching on all those points there, because it's true, Trump does have a lot of support. And I do think sometimes, of course, we know that the media can shy away from bringing other views, but it isn't looking good. It does appear to be one thing after the other. A lot of people are saying, isn't he going to run in 2024? I know Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, is promoting a book, and he's kind of teasing the fact that he would be. But how does this affect his Republican support? Because, of course, they want to win the next election. Can they win it if he's on the ticket?
Well, that really is a current debate. That's something that if you asked me that question 2 weeks ago, I'd have a different answer from this week going on to this week. You have a situation where at first, this, of course, galvanizes the Trump base. And one thing to keep in mind, one of the reasons why he is not officially announced as a candidate is because the Republican National Committee no longer could legally support his legal defenses if he was a candidate. So there's campaign finance rules that he's playing to his favor by not actually declaring. You have the obvious Ron DeSantis situation. You have the horrible, hurricanes going on in Florida right now. He's front and center showing a leadership thing. But if you poll inside the Republican Party, they're saying they want Trump. But if you start to poll the larger aspect, you can see how a different candidate could come in.
Really great talking to you, Errol Moorcock, Vice Chair of External Relations at Republicans Overseas. Great talking to you today, Errol. In a moment, we'll be bringing you the highlights from this year's Nigerian Global Economic Summit. But until then, here's a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week. Friday, September the 30th, is the final day that paper £20 and £50 banknotes will be considered legal tender. After this date, only polymer Bank of England banknotes will have legal tender status. According to official estimates, there are £6 billion of paper £20 banknotes and £8 billion worth of paper £50 banknotes still in circulation. Britons have been urged to exchange the old notes immediately. Apple has revealed that it will be manufacturing the new iPhone 14 in India as the American tech firm looks to shift some production away from China. Beijing's zero-COVID policy has disrupted production at factories across the country, which has highlighted some potential weak spots in Apple's supply chain. The company unveiled the iPhone 14 earlier this month, and it features a longer-lasting battery, more powerful camera, and a faster processor. Elon Musk has teased the unveiling of a humanoid robot during Tesla's annual AI Day this week. The tech billionaire first introduced the robot concept in 2021, and it is known as Optimus. Previous Tesla presentations have stated that Optimus will stand 5 feet 8 inches tall and will weigh 125 pounds. Musk joked that the robot would be designed to travel at a maximum speed of 5 miles per hour, so that humans would be able to run away from it and overpower it. It's expected to be used to replace human workers on the electric car maker's production line. To our final story this week, the Nigerian Global Economic Summit has taken place here in the British capital as part of an initiative by the Nigerian Global Business Forum. The two-day event has focused on 3 key areas, which include the role of global Nigerians in nation building, a detailed assessment of critical sectors, and the post-2023 economic outlook. Channel's Business Global was given exclusive access.
One would have thought that because of the election period that is just about to start today, we would wait and with the new government know what their plans are in terms of policy direction and whatever they are considering in terms of the program for the country. But we're taking it from a different perspective entirely. It says Outlook 2023, the Nigerian Global Economic Summit. So it is from the perspective of Nigerians in the diaspora, global Nigerians. Now, just to point here that we are talking about a sub-economy of about 150 billion pounds with an annual remittance of $25 billion into Nigeria. I think we can actually take a deep breath there in understanding the significant role that this group of people can play and must play in terms of transformation in Nigeria. Aspects of transformation in economy and also social. So we are going to be, over the next 2 days, hearing from speakers across the globe who will be addressing various aspects of interest, whether it's in technology, in education, in agribusiness, basically pointing at the prospects and the huge potential that Nigeria has to give. Just like I said, this is a community that can play a definite and significant role in terms of moving Nigeria to where Nigeria ought to really be. And that is why we are here over the next 2 days.
The diaspora tend to be more exposed, more knowledgeable in finance. You go through mortgages, loans, so everything, credit, so you understand it a bit more. And also, you see, that is needed. And there's a lot of private sector participation that is happening. People are coming back and setting up farms and competing, and showing the way that no, that's not the way it's done. It must be structured. It can't just be business like usual. So that is going to be very key in West African economies and the African economy, particularly as we go into the African continental free trade area. So that is massive and huge. And so we need all the expertise that the diasporas have acquired working in, you live in the UK, but you work in Europe. And then after Brexit, you are able to cope and see what's happening. So we need all that back home now.
My background is in the education sector in the UK. And one of the things I do, because I've got a finance background, and is to make sure we have lots of kids in school to help the funding, because if you don't have, the government funds you based on the number of students you have. So as a finance director, I go out there to make sure kids are in school, you understand, because we've got zero tolerance. And when I go back home to Nigeria, I find Nigerian children on the street. So it became a moral dilemma for me, saying Nigerian children are on the street, but I'm meanwhile trying to get the British child into the classroom. So I thought, what can I do to help? So because I'm based in the diaspora, I thought I'll raise the funds in the diaspora and then take those funds back home to pay the fees and educational needs of these children. I would like to encourage all the presidential candidates that whoever is successful to be the next president of Nigeria, to please pay more attention to Nigeria. In terms of resources, to dedicate more resources. At the moment, we spend less than 7% of our total budget on education. I would like to see that number doubled. We need to invest in our education system. Lots of children are out of school. University undergraduates are out of school as well. Our educational system is in a meltdown. So I would like to encourage the government to actually pay attention today. Actually, it should be a standing agenda item at the weekly government meeting. So this will be my plea to whoever becomes the next president of Nigeria.
And we started off before COVID-19 pandemic. We saw the opportunity that technology presents in helping to address those gaps. One of the critical barriers to access to healthcare in Africa and Nigeria is the shortage of doctors. And you will have seen even recently there's been mass exodus of doctors from the country, from the continent, to Europe, to the UK, to the US, and people are living in droves. The WHO reckons that Nigeria only has about 10% of the healthcare workforce that we need to our population size. And assuming we have everything in place right now in terms of the money, infrastructure, everything, it would take us about 10 decades to get to that number, the doctor-to-patient ratio that we need, to population ratio that we need. But what is very exciting is that Nigeria, as with many other African markets, is one of the fastest growing in mobile technology adoption. We have nearly 500 million mobile subscribers across the continent who are on 3G and 4G network and even 5G now. And it presents a unique opportunity for us to address those healthcare challenges. More than 60% of medical problems can be resolved virtually through telemedicine, and there's no other way that we have been able to demonstrate this than during the COVID pandemic. You saw how the pandemic has catalyzed the adoption of telemedicine across the world. Over 4,000% increase in the West. In Africa, we're also not lacking in innovation, so we have over 500 to 1,000% increase in the adoption of telemedicine. So that's one of the silver lining of the pandemic.
We have so many programs, and it's my duty as a High Commissioner to bring the investment, trade and industry section here to be part of this, to lead our team so that we can collaborate. And that kind of synergy between the public and private sector is very important. Like I always say, it's time we move from talk and talk to talk and do. And that's just the objective of being here today.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today, but as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channels Business Global. Goodbye.